Hi, Jeannie. This is Ira. I'm sharing here my audio feedback on your statement of belief, which I hope will be helpful as you move from this sort of more intuitive, free-form, just kind of effort to start thinking about what you think towards the more rigorous and systematic, theoretical uh, essay defining good argument in digital contexts. So, I want you to hear my comments here not as like critique or problems with this assignment, which you did a perfectly fine job on. This is a good start towards the next thing, but rather as a set of challenges and possibilities for you to take up and consider as you move from this intuitive statement of belief to your own more rigorously thought through and argued definition. So, right off the bat, you say a good argument is strong and valid with plausible premises that are true and are relevant to the conclusion. So that's really a lot to take in. And immediately I would wonder, is there a difference between strong and valid here for you? If so, what is that difference? What makes an argument strong and what makes it valid? How are the two related? Typically, we think about validity as a logical operation. So yes, no, true, false, validity. And we often think about strength in argument as being about effectivity, like persuasiveness, which may or may not be related to or drawn from logical validity. So anyways, I'd be interested to hear you think more about the relation between those things. I would caution you a little bit when you say plausible premises that are true and are relevant to the conclusion. Like, I think it's actually really interesting. So you're saying essentially the premises have to not only be true, i.e. the premises for the argument have to not only be factually correct or reality-based, they also have to be plausible. In other words, they also have to be things that the audience can find believable. And so that's interesting because sometimes we have premises that are true, but that our audience wouldn't find believable. And so this definition that you have here would suggest that those make for bad argument, which might be true or might not, but I'd be interested to hear you say more about the relation between plausible and true premises. What makes premises plausible and what makes them true, and how are those things related and also maybe in tension with each other. So I hear I'm a little bit confused what you mean. So when you say there are many ways that arguments can happen, it allows the public to recognize the several types of scenarios for each situation. I'm a little bit unclear on what that means exactly. Although I do think that your next point is a very good one, which is that arguments can take place in a lot of different ways. It can be mediated in a lot of different ways. And I'd like to see you say more about how what arguments are for. So one of the things that as I read this, I find myself a little unclear about or wondering is what you think arguments are for. Okay, fair enough. Many people assume they're just revolving around something negative. And you say they can be as simple as someone trying to get their point across, or they can be someone else using valid points to counteract the claim. Fair enough. But in general, what are arguments for? Why is some argument good and other argument bad relative to the purpose of arguments? I think one of the common threads that pops up a lot here is that we shouldn't be afraid to speak our minds or voice our opinions. And I think that's, I think you're right. You're trying really hard throughout this essay to balance the space between we should speak our minds and we should be duly attentive to others, and we should find a way to navigate between those two things. So I'd like to hear you articulate a little more fully the relationship between speaking one's mind and conveying a message effectively to an audience. So how are those things in tension, and how do they fit together? How do we resolve the tension? How do we negotiate between the need to speak our mind on the one hand and the need to effectively reach an audience on the other hand? Now, when you talk about us needing to listen to one another more, I'm curious whether you see that because you said because it could be beneficial to comprehending their claim and point of view. And I'm curious if you see what role you see good listening as playing in arguments that are not interpersonal. So, for instance, when you or I listen to an advertisement, we hear something that's not really for us personally, right? It's for a mass audience, and we just happen to be part of that audience. In other words, the person making the advertisement didn't exactly have us individually in mind. They had a kind of person sort of like us, but not us individually. And so what does that mean for good argument? Can advertisements be good argument? They don't really understand a lot of times the individual opinions of their audiences. They don't understand necessarily your opinions or my opinions. Does that mean that they can't be good arguments? Or can they still be good arguments? And not just advertisements, but also like presidential addresses or televised debates, which are not really for the debaters, in a sense. Each debater is only somewhat talking to the other person. They're also talking to you and I. They're talking to their audience, the larger audience. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the relationship between listening and understanding and these forms of argument that are a little more unilateral, a little bit less interpersonal or less bilateral between individual persons. Now, when you talk about many people just enjoy causing arguments with other people for no reason, I'm okay. Do you think it's really for no reason? Let's think about that a little bit more. What are the reasons that people like to have quote-unquote arguments for no reason? Surely they have reasons, otherwise they wouldn't do it, right? We might not have good reasons, we might not have conscious reasons, but every action has a cause, right? So we all have reasons in some sense of the word. What do people get out of unproductive arguments? How do those bad arguments help us understand better, by contrast, the purpose of good arguments? So this maybe will help you think a little bit more about what good arguments are for. You talk about bad arguments being not necessarily negative, but usually consisting of unreasonable assumptions, and no background information. You say to counteract their claim. I think you mean to support their claim. But regardless, so, or maybe you mean to counteract their claim. I'm not totally clear there what the primary thing is that you want to say. But the point of taking bad arguments as a contrast that can help us see good arguments precisely by showing us what good arguments aren't, I think is helpful. But I also kind of find myself wanting to say, okay, well, good. So what are unreasonable assumptions? How do we know when our assumptions or somebody else's assumptions are unreasonable? And when it comes to background information, what does that mean exactly? What is background information for? Why does it matter? Now, you do talk a little bit here about strength, again, and so it's the strength of supporting details in a relationship between the premise and the conclusion. And I'd like to hear you say more about how good argument draws on details that connect premises and conclusions. What is the exact nature of the relationship via details between premises and conclusions, and how do good arguments make that link in a way that bad arguments don't? I want to challenge you a little bit when you say that a good argument should have little or no assumptions at all. I think that might be. Let's see, sorry. Yeah. here that might be a bridge too far. We make an enormous number of assumptions, right? Most of what we do in the world is based on a series of assumptions about what's normal, what's reasonable, what's good, what's appropriate, what's bad, what's harmful, what's fair, what's not fair, so on and so forth. And we often assume that the people we're talking with more or less agree about a lot of those basics. But in point of fact, we often strongly disagree with each other, right? When that's one of the things we sometimes find out in an argument that we didn't realize. So you might be setting the bar a little high when you say that good argument should make little or no assumptions. And I wonder how you might reframe that, or how you might address that criticism, if you want to hang on to that. You have a nice piece about quarter here, and one of the things that you really get out of that, I think, that's really helpful is that every time an argument emerges, we're in search of something, and I think that's really, and you then think about argument as getting us towards adventure. Now here we're starting to think about what arguments are for. And I'd love to see you thinking through that lens right from the beginning. I think it's a very interesting lens, right? You're saying essentially arguments are how we engage with the possibilities of risk and adventure. They're how we engage with newness in the world, with the unknown or the unfamiliar. And I'd like to hear you say more about exactly that relationship and what it tells us about what arguments are for, and accordingly, how it helps us think systematically about what good arguments are and are not, and require and do not require and should avoid, and so on and so forth. I think, by the way, just in general, I would recommend against a conclusion sentence that restates directly wherever you began, just as a general, sort of writing principle. It's nice to end by returning to your original principles and deepening those or elaborating them, but just restating them verbatim it feels for a reader often a little just sort of repetitive. Okay, but that's just a small thing. I'm really interested to see where you go from here. I look forward to reading you going forward and to thinking with you about what you want to count as good argument and why. So as you move into the major essay for the course, Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts, I hope you won't hesitate to reach out to make an appointment or meet with me in office hours. And I look forward to reading and talking with you more soon. All right. Thanks.